If a reasonable skeptic said that such things do not exist, he can only mean to say that they do not exist relative to his knowledge, because to deny the possibility of the existence of anything of which we know nothing would imply that we imagined ourselves to be in possession of all the knowledge that exists in the world, and believe that nothing could exist of which we did not know. Franz Hartmann, Paracelsus and the Substance of His Teachings. Join us tonight for episode 3 of Into the Portal as we investigate the lore of the homunculus. Hello, and welcome back into the portal. I'm Andrew McKay.
And I'm Amber Ray.
So welcome back for part 1 of 2 for this third episode of Into the Portal.
Yep, we're breaking it up.
We ended up splitting it up, which is actually kind of funny because when we first started talking about what we wanted to do for episode 3, we thought we would try to maybe choose something that we could maybe get into for an episode that was under an hour or something.
A little lighter.
But then sure enough, we were down the rabbit hole and
of course.
Way too much to look into. So it's going to be our first ever 2-parter, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
So we have a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. Why don't you go for that there, Amber?
Not much to say, really. All I want to say is that we do have a bookstore up and running now. And I'm super pumped on that.
Yeah.
Looks awesome. It's on the website. Visit intotheportal.com for all that good stuff. As well, I did want to give a shout out to Big Bruce 55. Thank you so much for your lovely review. That made me very happy.
Yeah, our first ever Google Play review, which is cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was pumped.
We've been getting tons of great feedback. Lots of reviews on iTunes, but yeah, you can do them on Google Play Music as well, which is great. Yeah.
One other exciting thing we do want to mention right off the bat here, in relation to the first bit, right, about the 2 parts. So basically, in our second part, we're going to be having a guest expert in the field of alchemy. Yes. And so that will be with Travis J. Dow of the History of Alchemy podcast. We first discovered him on, what was it? The episode of Castle Huska with Astonishing Legends.
Yeah, he came on there for, I think it was that one where he came on for an interview. But
he also does the Bohemian podcast too. So you might have heard of him from there.
Yeah, Podcast Nick is his little group of podcasts and things, which
collective.
is super cool. But yeah, History of Alchemy is awesome. You guys should go check it out. But we're going to bring him on for part 2, which is, kind of the main reason why we split this up. So yeah, we've got a ton of content to get to in part 1 alone, and then we wanted his expertise for part 2.
So basically we're going to give you an overview and some background information, and then we're going to lead up to a teaser, and then next week we'll have more information from Travis.
So let's get into it. So this episode is all about, its roots are in alchemy, but we are covering the lore, the legend of the homunculus, which, if you've never heard of it before, which I certainly hadn't before I started to look into this, and this was totally Amber's idea, and to be totally honest, I was a little bit hesitant about it at first, but as soon as I started to look into it, I was like, wow, this is bizarre. This totally fits with what we do.
You didn't think we'd have enough content.
I didn't think we'd have enough content, and sure enough, here we are, two parts.
2 parts.
Pretty hilarious.
Yeah.
So the definition of a homunculus, we're just going to do just the basics here. It is a Latin term for little human, little man. So ideally, it's a fully formed miniature human-like, emphasis on the like.
But they're artificially grown.
Artificially grown miniature humanoid creatures that alchemists, tons of different recipes.
All throughout the years they've claimed to have made.
But this is, this has been a reoccurring thing for millennium, really. So we're going to get into some of the background of it. Super cool story. Really bizarre. At first I was
we should mention that there are some alternative conceptions. Like, when you Google homunculus, you're going to see a whole bunch of models of the sensory organs of the human body. Things like big old lips, big hands, big whatever. And that is a completely different thing.
Yeah,
so don't get that confused.
So in the modern field of psychology, I guess, that's where it came up, I believe, right? So that's the idea of like the sensory perception and how it's linked to the brain and how it's mapped in the brain.
Exactly.
But we're getting into the ancient definition, the origin of the word per se. So let's I'm gonna get right into that, into the background here. So what we
What's
came
the
up with...
earliest example?
Yeah, so like the earliest example that we could find was from something that's called the Book of the Cow, which, if you try to Google that too, you're going to come up with a bunch of Egyptian texts for the Book of Cow, which is totally different. But if you slip in it was a book by Plato. So it was a work from the Greek philosopher Plato, who, I mean, it's sort of up in the air exactly when it was written, but it's somewhere in the 4th century BC, something like that. And this is supposedly the earliest reference that we
both found.
We found. So basically what this says, so they talk about the procedures for creating a homunculus, and there's a bunch of different recipes, like I just said. We're not going to get into the detail of all of them for the reason that it is really gross.
Yeah, it's pretty disgusting.
It's pretty gross, at least for the substances used that we know what they are. So, but I'll give a little...
And then there's all those very obscure ones that you're like, I don't even know what that is supposed to be.
Dragon's teeth and stardust. And
very
those
strange.
are kind of some questions that I definitely want to save for Travis for part 2.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so the Book of Cow. So earliest reference... And it basically says that it references 2 different types of recipes. So all of the homunculus, it requires basically human bodily fluids, one of them being semen.
A lot of it.
A lot of it. And then a different type of animal of some kind. So it's usually be like the womb of a cow. In the Book of Cow, they reference an unknown animal in one recipe, and then another, the womb of a monkey.
So they're not using glass jars yet.
They're not using glass jars yet.
Was glass even a thing back then?
The vessels were definitely different in the 4th century.
I guess they were using clay pots back then.
Yeah, so they were still using an incubation of... They started with animal.
That makes a lot more sense, hey? Like using, the womb of another biological organism.
Rather than just
as opposed to a sterile jar.
Yeah, totally. But essentially what they're trying to do with all this, and the idea behind alchemy itself, is transmutation.
Yes.
And that word carries a lot of baggage with it, I think, but really all it means is changing...
Transmutation of matter, specifically.
Right. Mm-hmm. So why don't you just give a little bit more on that, then? I mean, transmutation essentially is
that's pretty much all I got.
Like,
it's a precursor to modern chemistry.
Right.
And a lot of the times it does get conflated with this mythical transforming of, a lot of the times, metals into gold as like the goal of all alchemists, which really was laughable by a lot of alchemists.
Yeah,
so
that's a stereotype for
it
sure.
really
for
is,
alchemy.
yes.
It wasn't just about that, and we're gonna give some examples of how ancient alchemists really did contribute to modern chemistry.
So it all really starts with Aristotle and alchemy.
Okay.
Well, that's what I found, at least, in the West, because there is a Chinese version of alchemy that definitely has different origins.
Yep.
I have a quote here from John Lienhard from the University of Houston, and he says, quote, "Alchemy originated when Aristotle took up an older idea that all matter combined the 4 elements of earth, air, fire, and water. He guessed that these elements could be changed or transmuted by the action of heat and cold, or dampness and dryness." End quote.
Interesting.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so that's more of a practical definition. There were elements of Neoplatonism, and that kind of goes after the idea of it's something higher than the pursuit of matter. Right. Like Platonism. He was
well, we should give a tiny bit. So Neoplatonism essentially
it's a resurgence of Platonic ideology,
right?
That originated
with
before.
Plato.
Obviously. Yeah, Greek culture. And definitely, he had this idea that there was sort of like the meta realm, right? Where things, like the forms of things existed. I remember being in like Philosophy 101 and they were saying, I don't even know exactly how this went down, but they were saying like the form of a chair. They had this analogy with a chair. And I remember I just got so confused, and this was my first little taste of philosophy, and I was like, hey, you know what, I don't know if this is for me. I wish I had paid more attention, though. That was my first year of university.
Yeah, that might have been a little bit helpful, eh?
But anyways, so with Neoplatonism, it's more of a metaphysical, spiritual, or philosophical pursuit of knowledge and enlightenment, essentially. So anyways, those are all elements that played into pre-scientific revolution ideologies and all that.
And
so
alchemy.
Alchemy was definitely part of that sort of pre-scientific revolution.
So what else do you have there on Aristotle? Let's get a little bit more background on him, because he is, obviously he came after Plato. I mean, well, we'll get into him more later for sure, because he had some interesting thoughts on elements and the energies from the earth and the ideas behind nature and stuff like that. And that sort of ties into the ingredients and the things that were going into alchemical recipes and stuff like that, which I think is really cool.
Well, Aristotle never directly referenced a homunculus or any recipe relating to a homunculus.
He did not. About that he didn't. He didn't believe in that, but he did believe in the idea that there were fully formed, like you just said, like a fully formed human man inside of a sperm. Things like that. He believed in the
so the animalcules theory.
Yeah,
and that goes into the preformationist theory, if I'm getting that correct.
Yeah, I think that's...
But anyways, we'll talk about theories later on. We just want to get some more background, right, as to alchemy and, it's early authorities in the subject. You had some information about a Ge Hong.
Yeah, Chinese alchemist Ge Hong. Mm-hmm. So this guy was really interesting because he came up with all kinds of things that would later be, pop up in like modern chemistry and things like that. But he wasn't the typical alchemist. He wasn't trying to
Aristotle, hey?
Not from the stuff that I looked at.
They kind of had their own foundation, right?
He was operating in the 2nd century. So a couple hundred years, or 2nd century AD. So this is like, 600 plus years after Aristotle. I'm sure he took a lot from the works of all those Greek philosophers for sure. But basically, the cool thing about Ge Hong was that he was interested in gold, and he had a recipe for making mosaic gold, which is essentially like a type of like a gold flake kind of thing, and that's still used today for like gilding things, so picture frames and like, other jewelry and like things like that. So that's a good example of like a very, early alchemist and sort of a process that's still,
Wasn't he the tinfoil guy?
Yeah, he was. So that was another thing too. He created a type of tinfoil metal paper. Probably not exactly like the tinfoil you're finding in your cupboard today, but he did come up with this tinfoil metal paper, and this amazed people. This blew people away.
It's fascinating to think that people thought it was magic, right?
Well, how could you not?
Alchemy, transformation, yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean, it's like all of a sudden you have this thin, flexible metal paper that you can wrap things in.
You can literally tear it like a piece.
It's bizarre. If you had never seen something like that before, you'd be blown away.
And even paper itself, right? Like that was
totally
a crazy invention too.
That's all. If you hadn't seen any of these things before,
let's just do an episode on the history of paper.
Oh yeah, we'll bring in Michael Scott as an interview.
We're definitely not gonna do that.
Definitely.
Oh,
not.
Michael Scott! You just
The Office reference.
That's an Office reference.
That just happened for sure. But anyway, Ge Hong. But he was interested in a lot of things. So the cool thing about Chinese alchemy, and I guess this crosses over into the Greek philosophers and other branches of alchemy around the world, that it was philosophical and spiritual. And it wasn't necessarily just about changing something into something else. So for Ge Hong, he practiced traditional Chinese medicine. His interests were spiritual, and these are all things that were closely linked to alchemy, but not directly. And so this Eastern philosophy of enlightenment and all these things was basically his version of the elixir of life. And that's where the idea of taking that, a lot of these alchemical stories like the homunculus and other things are more allegorical, where his elixir of life, his philosopher's stone for Ge Hong, it's not an actual rock that you find that you can live forever. It's the idea of transcendence, the idea of reaching this level of enlightenment, and that was the elixir of life. So it's this kind of a cool
interesting
crossover between spirituality and then the material alchemical world.
And that's kind of the line that we've crossed several times, right, in the course of our research, the idea of homunculus as an allegory versus an actual physical thing. And that's interesting that the elixir of life / philosopher's stone can be thought of that way. I was confused as to where this concept came from. And the earliest reference I got to any sort of form of an elixir or, like a, immortality type substance, that type of thing. The earliest known reference I got was actually from Greek mythology.
Yeah.
And it's not actually called the elixir of life or anything, but basically it's the food of the gods is how it's described. And it's this ambrosia and nectar. So ambrosia is the food and nectar is the drink of the gods. Apparently, what was his name? Not Thor. Achilles' heel.
Oh,
Apparently
right.
when he was
Yeah,
born,
that's-
he was bathed in ambrosia. And it's a substance that comes from a magical horn of the goat Amalthea. So I'm assuming that's a type of marrow
It
substance.
sounds like it would be something like that.
Yeah, but again, that's very... that can be just... Yeah, that's a
bizarre.
stretch. I don't know how anyone would find this magical goat and how they would suck this substance out of it. But anyways, yeah.
But that's the story of alchemy to me. It's that
really
there's
is,
a bunch of ingredients and different things used in all kind, not just for the homunculus, but all kinds of things that we can look to and say, okay, we know how that element behaves now, or we know what those combinations do now. But then there's references to all these things that we don't even know what they were. I mean, yeah, you can say magical goat. What does that even mean?
Or dragon's bones and blood.
Exactly. What does that mean? Are they getting kimono dragon bones on the black market from the Near East, or is this like an actual cryptid creature that has been?
Or is it something that is sold as like ground up dragon bones, but literally it's just flour or something?
So it could be anything. That's the interesting thing, is there's all these sort of bizarre ingredients with no specifics behind them.
So my next story, actually, well, not story, but my next person, just going into early alchemist. Are you done with Gei Hong, or?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but he was just a really good reference for alchemists,
for really early
alchemy that was just focused on more legit, like, trial and error in chemistry. Yeah, he came up with tinfoil. I mean, gunpowder was a product of alchemy, right? Like the Chinese came up with gunpowder. That was,
maybe that's Stardust.
Could be. The earliest reference to gunpowder was in the 2nd century AD, from what I looked at. So that was the same era as Gei Hong. So definitely a lot of things that came out of alchemy that were beneficial to science and to humanity. I mean, maybe not gunpowder per se. Definitely led to a lot of negative things, but yeah, no, it's really cool.
Leading into that, because we want to go chronologically, eh?
We're trying to.
A little bit, yeah. So we've gone Plato to Aristotle to Gei Hong, even though he's not actually associated culturally.
No.
My next person is Zosimus of Panopolis, who was an Egyptian alchemist. So he was around circa 300 AD, approximately. I couldn't find an exact date.
Okay.
But basically this guy, I have a quote here from a Fate magazine article, where Zosimus apparently described how an artificial man could be made by the use of dragon's bones, blood, and the Philosopher's Stone. So, the trifecta. Anyways, yeah, and a lot of people have that reference is a little iffy. I wasn't actually able to find that exact passage in another source, which in my academic brain is just like, red flag.
Totally.
But anyways, it was very interesting. And I did come across some theory from Carl Jung, actually. This is a bit confusing because, like, in the visions, there was this Visions of Zosimus, which was written by the guy, and it was a philosophical text. And in it, he has several dreams and, like, dream visions and things like that. And in this article I read by Carl Jung, he never actually referenced an explicit recipe. So there is a bit of, discrepancy there. But basically, Carl Jung, he goes with the more metaphorical or allegorical explanation about
what era was he around in again? I mean, he was...
he was the same era as...
Right?
Carl?
Yeah.
No, God, no. He was early 20th century, contemporary of Freud.
Oh, I'm mixing them up. Oh, yeah. Right.
Yeah, they were the two, psychoanalytic psychologists.
That's right.
Anyways.
How could I forget that?
But yeah, so that was Carl's take on it. There's others that have kind of said that Zosimus was inspired by the myth of Cadmus in Greek mythology, which I found really cool. So the story goes here, that this guy, Cadmus, he was the son of Agenor, the king of Tyre. I don't know, Tyre.
The king of Canadian Tire.
King of Canadian Tire there, bud. Anyways, so yeah, the story goes that this guy, he had a sister who was essentially kidnapped by Zeus. And in retaliation, I guess his mom and dad basically withered into nothing because they were just devastated over this loss. And so Cadmus, he decides to go looking for her. And anyways, how the story goes, this is a quote here, Cadmus went looking for them, so Zeus and his sister Europa, and soon came face to face with an enraged dragon. Cadmus attacked the malevolent monster, and after a fierce struggle, managed to slay it. He then sacrificed the cow, the cow, that's weird that he refers to it as the cow, anyway, sorry, who told him to get the teeth of the dragon and plant half of them in the ground. As soon as Cadmus did so, a host of fierce warriors appeared out of the ground, and, before Cadmus could engage them, the armed men began a ferocious and bloody battle amongst themselves. That's not very effective.
No, that seems counterintuitive.
But, yeah, a lot of people take that as sort of the inspiration for this Zosimus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Very cool side note.
That is a cool side note.
But that's interesting, hey? You can just sow teeth into the earth and humans pop up.
That reminds me of like the orcs from Lord of the Rings,
yes.
right? Where they grow out of the mountain.
Yes. And it also actually brought to mind the mandrake.
From Harry Potter. Mm-hmm. There's so many.
And also, the mandrake did exist outside of Harry Potter.
Oh, of course.
Lore, just so everyone's
obviously,
aware,
Harry Potter's only been around since the,
right?
the last 20
But a lot of
years.
people think, like, oh, J.K. Rowling came up with all that on her own. Nope.
I mean, fantastic books and movies, but yeah, no. But yeah, so many. I mean, there's other cool references in Harry Potter to alchemy too. Hey, like I think Albertus Magnus is referenced in Harry Potter, and there was another one of those books.
Well, Nicholas Flamel.
Nicholas Flamel.
He was based off a real person. I can't remember if that was his real name or not, though. Anyways, read a little side note about
There's
that.
alchemy in all kinds of popular culture, that's for sure.
So, I have one more early alchemist.
Let's hear it.
It's a very, very, very short side note, but a lot of people will know him if they're familiar with alchemy at all. His name is Jabir. I'm totally going to butcher this. Jabir. Oh my god.
Try your best.
Jabir Ibn Hayyan. It's IBN. So I'm like, Ibn. Anyways.
Ibn.
So he was around between 721 to 815. And so he was one of the earliest known near alchemists. So within that culture, I can't remember if he was in Turkey, he was somewhere around there, but he was one of the first in that region.
Okay.
And people he took up a lot of the same ideas and continued on with Aristotle. So he definitely, he thought the idea of the four elements and the hot, dry, wet, cold processes were his basis for understanding alchemy. And basically, there is a reference in Islamic alchemy to this certain goal of this artificial creation of life in the laboratory up to and including the human. So again,
really,
they don't call it a homunculus this was from the World Heritage Encyclopedia, by the way.
Interesting.
But definitely all this will be in our show notes.
Yeah.
I just thought that was interesting. Yeah, just a very early reference. I never found any explicit recipes again from this guy, but he was just continuing on with the trend, hey? Yeah. And that was the only version of scientific chemistry that they knew of, so to me, there's a lot of legitimacy there. Like, they're pioneers.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, alchemy just gets it has a certain connotation to it. People think of it in relation to the stereotypes, creating gold, creating the elixir of life, all these kinds of things. But really, it was just a term that, designated to people who are experimenting with stuff. Mm-hmm. You're experimenting with different elements, you're experimenting with whatever.
And, that sort of jaded perception we have of them might have been a result of the slight anger of the status quo of academia at that time, right? Because if you're pushing these boundaries and you're going down rabbit holes, so to speak, and maybe not using all the kosher ideas of the time, whether it's religious or otherwise, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, definitely.
They were unorthodox.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to get
and
at,
as soon as things started to shift into the era of empiricism after the Baconian empiricism or whatever, people don't like to have their results, they don't want to have anybody that's not related to science contrasted with their work. So alchemists, moving into the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries,
the heretics.
They were the heretics, even though really it's just like, okay, they were just the people that were taking a few things that maybe more mainstream scientists weren't willing to experiment with.
Yeah, for the sake of their careers, perhaps. There's so many academics
you see that today.
Yeah,
totally. Where people I'm not going to do.
not touching that with 10-foot pole because it's my career.
Even
on.
For me, I've mentioned the idea of pre-Columbian contact theories, when we were at university, and bring that up with professors, and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm really fascinated about that," especially in the anthropology department. Really fascinating. But if you spend a ton of time and publish a paper on that, people are going to look down their nose at you.
Oh yeah.
So definitely that is something that would be coming up in the 16th, 17th centuries too, for sure.
Definitely.
But I'm glad there's people out there that are still willing to try the bizarre, and we just get to talk about it, which is kind of fun.
Let's just try making a homunculus.
I guess we could, although
we gotta find some ingredients. I don't know. The belly of a sow, or just a glass jar. I guess we can use that as our. We just need a bunch of horse manure.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to give one of those stories? Do you have any of those queued up?
Well, that's kind of where I feel like this is leading.
Yeah.
Yeah. So since we've covered, a couple early alchemists leading up to, this is basically like what we would refer to as the Dark Ages, if you're just being really like, blanket coding.
Yeah.
Really wasn't Dark Ages.
No, it wasn't. That was just the term because there wasn't a ton of great record keeping.
Exactly.
And it's not as if there weren't arts and there weren't whatever. It's hilarious, right? Like when you're in
you think it's
high
just
school,
chaos,
you think it's
and
like
you're just like
everything. The weather was always terrible,
right? Plagues everywhere, disease, famine. Oh my God, you can't do anything.
No, there was a massive flourishing of arts and sciences too, alchemy too, for sure.
Yeah. So, anyways, moving on from that.
Yeah.
So we're moving into basically the High Middle Ages. So this is pre-scientific revolution still. This period spans between 1500s to mid 1700s.
Yep.
So one of my favorite homunculus stories goes with these two Austrians. Their names were Abe Geloni and Count Kufstein.
Count Kufstein.
Both of them were pretty shady characters. Geloni was apparently a supposed mystic and Rosicrucian, which we'll get into in the second part.
Yep.
And as well, Count Kufstein was a Freemason. So anyways, there's
People
that.
definitely don't trust Freemasons. I don't really like.
It's funny. You can go on their website and you're like, oh, you really don't have much to hide, but you're very obscure still too.
Very
like
mysterious.
I saw some photos from their Facebook, the Ohio branch Facebook account. Very odd.
Yeah, it's obscure. It's very
They're all
strange.
wearing these white gloves. You're like, what is that? Anyways,
Just wash your hands. Why do you need the gloves?
Purity. Anyway, no, I don't think they're purists.
No.
Anyways, so yeah, this was in 1775. So this is a later. Excuse me. This is a later account, and apparently, Count Johann Ferdinand von Kufstein, together with this Abe Geloni, who was an Italian cleric / mystic / Rosicrucian. I
mean, those are just labels. I mean, like
they are.
Like,
no, this is just rumors.
Yeah, these people were labeled whoever opposed them wanted to label them, right? So just to say, because I don't want it to sound as if the stories behind, because a lot of these people who claimed to, and we're going to get into that in part 2 in even more detail with some of the people more modern era who have claimed to have created homunculus. They're reputable people, or they knew reputable people.
And then they have this weird mention or a blurb, and you're just like, what?
Right.
Okay.
So there's these links and associations with very reputable people in society and European culture and things like that. It's very bizarre. Anyway, continue.
So these two have reportedly created a court of homunculi. So this is 10 homunculi. And they all were in glass containers, apparently kept at Kufstein's Masonic Lodge in Vienna.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading
And there is a German, I don't know what his actual, he's a doctor of some sort, he's got a PhD or whatever. Anyways, his name is Emil Besetzi. And he wrote Die Sphinx, which actually has a more detailed chapter relating to this account, but I couldn't find an English version. So if anyone can find that for me, that'd be great.
We'll have to wait for our friend Josh to come home and you can translate it.
Come home from Japan. God. Anyways, so these two, they created a whole court, including a king, a queen, a monk, a nun, a seraph, which I'm not even sure what that is, an architect, a miner, and two more ambiguous things called a blue spirit and a red spirit. The blue spirit reportedly, these were just like colors that would kind of like float in the liquid of the jars. And then you would wrap on the seal of the jar, which was an oxen bladder, and you would speak in Hebrew. So this is very esoteric, right?
Totally.
Getting into that.
Well, and there's a bit behind that. Yeah, keep going.
So the red spirit was apparently very satanic, and it basically was like the devil's face would appear. And in the blue jar, the blue spirit was very angelic. So it's almost like, bipolar.
Good and evil,
Right? But the coolest part about this story to me was that these 10 homunculi were produced under questionable circumstances, obviously. They were in glass jars. They did have some sort of biological ingredients in the jars, and they were buried under horse manure for, I can't remember how many weeks. I think it was 6 weeks.
I think that's.
And then by the time they unearthed them, they were about 6 inches tall. And each one, the funnest part about this is that each one of them, they're almost like meta-humans, because like they were able to predict things about the future, and they had their own, they were specialists. They had this knowledge that they would basically, how it was relayed was that basically Kufstein would take these to his Masonic meetings, and they would spout off knowledge and all these crazy, like, you know, wonderful wisdoms about the world.
Right.
And it was all highly specialized. So things like the king, he would only talk about politics. The monk would talk about religion, and same with the nun, I guess. The architect would talk about buildings and all the wonderful... Anyways, so all these, they all had their own little niche of knowledge, and I just thought that was so cool.
That is so fascinating. It's bizarre.
It is bizarre. And so anyways,
but it's really fascinating.
That's what we're all about.
Totally.
And it was so interesting, and apparently they weren't happy with the size of them, and so they ended up burying them again for another 6 weeks, and when they unearthed them, they were approximately 12 inches. They're almost too big for the jars after that. And the cutest part, I keep saying this, but anyways, I just love the story so much. The king was apparently just smitten with the queen and would always try and get out of his jar and go and climb in hers, like be together. And it was this whole funny thing. But that kind of doesn't make sense, because they do have other accounts where, because the jars would have to be cleaned, right? They were kept in water, essentially. And the jars would be cleaned like every week, every 2 weeks, that type of thing. Unless it was the red spirit. It had to be cleaned like every 2 or 3 days, or else it just stank, apparently.
Interesting.
But yeah, so when they were cleaning these, they would obviously take the little guys out, and they would faint. They would just be they would basically just look like they were just like going down to sleep and dying, essentially. But yeah, and then when they were put back in, they were revitalized. And so they had to live in water. That's weird. They're aquatic humanoid beings, miniature humanoids.
Well, that's just it, though. It's like they're like the descriptions are humanoid, but they're definitely not human. Mm-hmm. And of course, with that story, it's like you can see the allegory everywhere, like for modern culture, right? Like even the relationships between king and queen, and the hierarchy of the court and things like that.
Right? Yeah.
But it's a bizarre allegory.
It's weird.
It's like, why would you?
Because, I know we watched that little brief thing on the Bride of Frankenstein, where they actually, if you YouTube it, we'll have it in our show notes as well. Mm-hmm. If you go and search that up, you basically get a scene where, it's not Frankenstein, it's like his master is showing him his creations, and it's basically homunculi, and he pulls out these jars, and they're fully dressed, fully formed miniature humans, like the king's wearing a full, get up that a king would wear, and same with the queen and all that. So in my mind, I'm trying to picture this with Count Kufstein and all them, right?
Yeah.
Like, were these things clothes? Like, were they...
That's the weird part. Like,
cute little outfits
see, that's the part where I feel like there's embellishment with every historical story, right? Mm-hmm. Whether or not this is completely made up and it's 100% allegorical this is just one specific story, and we'll get into a few other accounts of homunculi. Whether or not it's completely 100% allegorical, I can't really say. It's a bizarre allegory if that's the route you're going, but why would you say that you've done this? In this
specific account, it does not translate as that at all.
No.
And in Emile Besettini, anyways, in his Die Sphinx, which is actually a Masonic handbook, by the way.
Oh, okay.
So he devotes an entire chapter to the subject, and he details numerous accountable persons that were able to testify to having seen this homunculi from the Masonic chapter themselves. Right. So people like Count Max Lamberg and Count Franz Joseph von Thun are both given as reputable examples.
So is there people just that witness this? I mean, and if there's going to be any group of people that are going to be able to have passed down some sort of esoteric knowledge throughout the centuries, it would be within the depths of Freemasonry. And that's the part about all this that's the most interesting to me, because at first when you brought this up, I'm like, that sounds ridiculous. I don't know if I want to do a full episode on that. Maybe we can do a mini episode, but we needed
to contextualize
there is a lot. Yeah, and I think we've done a good job of that so far, giving the background, but it's just, it doesn't make sense to me that all of this would be allegory, and just the fact that there's ingredients that we don't understand, and the idea that when we transitioned into an era of science and all these alchemists got shunned, knowledge got lost. There could have been something. There's a disconnect.
You even made the comment about the Library of Alexandria that one time.
Sure, yeah, like there could have been references to all kinds of different. Yeah,
what if all the secrets of the pyramids were in that library? And
they probably, some of them probably were in there, and they're gone forever. We'll never know, or well, not necessarily. We might, you never know. You could unearth things later on, but
it's all strange, man.
It's all bizarre.
Super bizarre. And another funny part about this account that I thought kind of related to current models and attempts at making a homunculus was the account of the death of the monk.
Right.
So the homunculi that was the monk, this was after Geloni had departed from Kufstein's company, but apparently one day Kufstein was carrying the jar of the monk and it shattered on the ground, and the monk died, and he was devastated, buried him in the backyard, in the garden, and he wasn't able to reproduce him without Geloni. And basically how it was described, that his attempts at making another one failed and resulted in a leech-like thing that died shortly. That reminds me of some of the things we've seen on some YouTube videos lately.
Yeah, we've watched a few YouTube. There's some modern, I'm doing air quotes, you can't see it because we're podcasting, alchemists that have been attempting to recreate homunculi.
Well, alchemists, like that one Russian guy, and then skeptics, people that are just taking a more, an approach that we would take, right? And being like, okay, let's just do this from a scientific standpoint. There was one guy I came across, he was trying to use, chicken eggs and duck eggs, and I can't remember what he was actually, if he was infusing it with sperm.
I saw that one too. Yeah, it was semen and
was there one with blood though, or something?
Yeah. Blood's incorporated.
They
I think
were so
blood
gross.
is incorporated in all the recipes.
Not all of them.
Most of them. I mean, it's either incorporated in the combination at the beginning, or you feed it with blood. So that's one of the common
I saw
things.
Several accounts that were like, after you bury it and everything, then you have to basically baste it in a disgusting mixture of all these biological and organic fluids.
And I feel like that is the obvious reason why, and that was the reason why I was so hesitant to do this show, even because the gross factor. You look at it and you're like, okay, this sounds ridiculous. Obviously, these things aren't real. It never existed. But when you start to dig deeper and you look at, and you're looking at all these references saying, oh, it's just 100% allegorical, or it's 100% this, 100% that. But then there's so much that we don't know about things they were using, or what type of esoteric knowledge was passed on. You can find that you can dig that up in any topic. How were the pyramids built? The Coral Castle in Florida. How the heck did that guy build the place? How were certain things done? And it ties into religion too. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Aristotle took a lot of his influence from Egyptian alchemy. Is that what you mentioned? I think was the connection.
Yeah. Ancient Egyptian culture, and then ancient Greek, pre-Greek culture.
Right. And ancient Jewish culture in the Kabbalah. The Jews were some of the best alchemists. They were scientists. They were in this, pursuit of knowledge for sure. And some of it was learned from Egyptian alchemists, while they were obviously in Egypt, and then eventually moved out of Egypt with Moses and all that jazz. But there's definitely ties to not only ancient alchemy, but religion as well. And the idea that it's not just tied into spirituality, but I mean, even Jesus is almost even like a reverse homunculus in that story, right? The virgin birth. So a lot of these things are tied into the idea of homunculi, the idea of creating life from matter.
Creating life from matter in
typical ways. Non-bio. And today we look at the ingredients used, and it's that's insane. There's no way. But then we're missing. The context is gone.
For example, what is the arcanum of human blood? The arcanum. Is that the plasma?
I don't know.
What the heck is that?
What is stardust?
Right?
Is that an asteroid from
this is where a meteor that's
crash landed? So this is why we're stoked to bring on Travis from the History of Alchemy for part 2. But these are things to me that don't people. That's the thing about modern science and empiricism and all that. It's we see something empirically, so that's how it is, right?
Well, that's just even I read an interesting article the other day about, oh my gosh, who was it? It was Michio Kaku, I think her name was, a physicist, and they have a book called Physicist of the Impossible, and they basically were making the point that, like, our society today is kind of bound by the measurable, the visible.
Yeah.
The rationalized version of everything, like, you know, and he made the point too, he went into, the idea of dark matter as... It is weighable, so it is measurable, but we can't perceive it.
No.
But it makes up 23% of our universe.
No.
So it's very strange. So
you
need a bit of both,
yeah.
right? You can't... It's almost like, we rely on science as our objective reality. When is there such a thing? Is science our new religion of this
Well, it totally
culture?
is. I mean, it comes down to the idea of epistemology, like your way of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And that ties into this for me. That's massively because there's this whole idea that we can try to pick apart things from the past. And if you're looking at something from the 17th century, it's more recent than 500 BC, obviously. But the point is that contexts change. The lenses in which we see the world change. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Legitimacy changes. And the ways of knowing change. So we transitioned into an era of empiricism and scientific knowledge, and that's how we see the world. But that's the whole idea behind esoteric knowledge, that there are things out there. There's things out there that we can't explain today in 2018. Mm-hmm. And maybe some of those things were explained or could have been explained in a different context and through a different lens millennium ago. Mm-hmm. Because the epistemology was different. We could see things differently. And
You're
now
throwing out big words there, just FYI.
Well, I did the definition. I mean, your way of knowing. Epistemology just means your way of knowing something, essentially, in broad strokes.
It's kind of funny, even just saying that and having such a basic definition. It's like, sure, way of knowing. Some people might think of an ideology as their way of knowing. But no, an ideology is something you subscribe to that you're more conscious of.
Right.
Your epistemology is something below the conscious level. It informs how you know what you know.
Right.
And why you know it.
Right. Gets into kind of,
Anyways,
Foucault,
if you want to pick up a Michel Foucault book, what was the one we read?
The Order of Things.
Yeah, that was a really cool read.
Very cool. It took me like 5 times through to really pick up.
And then once you
what
finish a
he was putting
chapter,
down.
you literally look at the beginning of the chapter, you're like, I don't understand.
Yeah, you got to reread each page like 5 times.
Yeah, pretty much.
But it's very interesting because it definitely ties into this. I mean, there's things that ancient peoples knew that we just simply don't today. And I think that might tie into some of the ingredients and things used in ancient alchemy.
And, that's a nice little segue into, our last... Well, we're not really going to get into Paracelsus. Just wanted to give him a brief mention before we wind down for part 1.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because this guy was he was a pioneer in medicine. He did do a lot of, breaking down those barriers and sort of expanding horizons of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Credited of bringing laudanum to Western medicine after travels abroad. And he was just, I don't know, he was a little bit of a maverick, I would say.
Paracelsus is going to be a focus for part 2.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he will be. He was a prominent alchemist of his time. He was the inspiration for Rosicrucianism too. A lot of people.
Yeah, so part 2, we're going to get into the details behind Rosicrucianism and
Freemasonry.
And Freemasonry.
The connections to homunculi and alchemic. I can't talk right now.
Alchemical
knowledge forms.
That's right. And a bunch of the other modern alchemists that kind of tie into this story of the homunculi.
Yeah.
And obviously our interview with Travis Dow.
Yeah. Lots to look forward to. But for now, we'll leave you with this from Franz Hartmann.
A person who peremptorily denies the existence of anything which is beyond the horizon of his understanding, because he cannot make it harmonize with his accepted opinions, is as credulous as he who believes everything without any discrimination. Either of these persons is not a free thinker, but a slave to the opinions which he has accepted from others.